Today, following up on David and Goliath, David and everyone else.
Welcome to Coffee with Creamer, where you get to sit down with our host, Dr. Barry Creamer, for a conversation about faith, life, and culture. We'll look at old ideas through a new lens, turn those culture wars on their head, and paint a picture of the way things could be. If you like your thinking deep and your coffee hot, pull up a chair. You're in the right place.
So, what we discussed last time, and I won't hash this out thoroughly, but briefly, were 3 garment armor exchanges in the David and Goliath story. David and Saul, where David rejects it because he doesn't become what he's not. He doesn't pretend to be king when he's not. He's a shepherd. And that's what he remains throughout. And then he takes Goliath's armor because he does become what he is, which is the champion. He is the one who wins the battles. And then the third exchange of armor, David and Jonathan, which concludes with the observation that you have to make, if you're reading the story in context, that Jonathan could have been the next king. He was qualified in every way that David is qualified. His experience with the Philistine garrison when he leads to this great victory on his own strength and skill and confidence and faith. When that happens with Jonathan, we know he could be the next king, but he's not. And so he gives his armor to David and his robes to David, and David becomes the one we know God has chosen, and Jonathan knows God has chosen him. So David is the chosen one, and that was the conclusion to the point of David and Goliath that we talked about last time. Now, where that leads is to a bunch of conclusions over and over and over again, really about one thing, what it means for David to be the chosen one. And so as you look at the stories that immediately follow David and Goliath, they all follow this pattern that you can't escape of everybody having to choose whether to be loyal to David or not, which basically means be loyal to Saul or be loyal to David. People want to be both. David is certainly both. David knows what he's called to, but he's loyal to Saul to a fault. And so what happens is Jonathan and David establish their friendship, but immediately Saul becomes jealous and then starts looking for ways to kill David over and over again. He even uses Michal, who demonstrates some loyalty to David at this point, as his wife at this point. And yet, later, they're going to come to odds, David and Michal. So it's an interesting story. We won't get to that part of the story as we're looking at it today. We'll only go through chapter 20, maybe a couple of implications into chapter 21 at the most. All of these things are happening in chapters 18 through 21. David and Goliath is chapter 17 in 1 Samuel. So this is what we're looking at. So immediately after that, Saul tries to kill David again, by sending the messengers to Michal's place. And then it ends with Jonathan and David out in the field establishing their covenant and how much they love each other and care for each other. Even though Saul is trying to kill him, Jonathan tries to persuade Saul to come back to him. This is that part of the story, okay? That's the whole part of the story that we're trying to cover. There is, just after that in chapter 21, the part we might or might not cover. It's not essential for us, but it does add, it adds a layer to the depth of this. You have David going to the high priest, or not the high priest, but to the priest, Ahitub, and asking him for the showbread, because his group is hungry and they need some kind of food. And Ahitub, it's Ahimelech. I'm sorry, not Ahitub. Ahimelech favors David and gives him the bread. And then immediately after that, David goes and hides in Gath, where Achish rejects him, is a poor host to him. So there's one who accepts him, one who rejects him. It's that throughout all of these stories. Now, in the middle of it, the one story that I skipped in it, the most fascinating one and the weirdest one, is the one I want to read to you first. It's in the middle of all of these other passages. It's in chapter 19, starting in verse 18 and going to the end of the chapter. This is in 1 Samuel. And this is just after Saul tries to kill David in his bed. He sends people to kill him or to take him to Saul so Saul can kill him, but to take him away from Michal. And Michal, deceives them along with David, deceives them with an image in the bed that, they pretend like he's in the bed when he's not and so on. So you'll remember that part of the story, I'm sure. And if not, I'll read to you part of it in a little bit anyway. But the point is, as soon as David leaves there, then he comes to Samuel. He goes back to his old mentor, the one who had anointed him and told him what he was going to be and so on. So David fled, this is in verse 18, and escaped of chapter 19. And he came to Samuel at Ramah, and he told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and lived at Naioth. And it was told Saul, hey, David's at Naioth in Ramah. And Saul sent messengers to take David. He's going to try to kill him again. He's always trying to find somebody to get rid of David because he feels threatened by him. He's going to lose his kingdom because of him. That's what he thinks. Then Saul sent the messengers to take David, and when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, this is part of the weird part, but not as fully weird as what's coming next. So he sends these messengers to take David, and so he sends the company of the prophets, when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as the head over them, the Spirit of God came on the messengers that Saul had sent, and they also prophesied. And when it was told Saul, hey, your guys sort of turned into prophets that are supporting Samuel now, then he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. So Saul's like, what does a man have to do here to get David back here so I can kill him? I'll go myself. So Saul sent messengers again the third time. They also prophesied. Then he himself went to Ramah. And he came to the great well that's in Secu. By the way, none of this is unusual. Sending the messengers so you can have somebody executed or somebody held accountable or whatever, and then eventually you just give up something. You recognize something's got to change here. That's the same kind of thing that happens with Elijah, remember. So in all of these episodes that happen, they are reminders, of this thing. I'll point it out to you in just a moment. But it's this reality that you just can't stop what God is doing. What are you going to use to overcome the omnipotent one, right? So this is what Saul is coming, you would think he would come to recognize. And so he himself goes to Ramah, Saul, so that he can get David. And he came to the great well that's in Secu, and he asked, where are Samuel and David? And one of them said, go see for yourself. They're over at Naioth and Ramah. And he went there to Naioth and Ramah. And the Spirit of God came upon him also, Saul, so hateful, with such a bitter spirit toward David, aside from whatever else is going on with him, that he's depressed or demon-oppressed or whatever it is that's going on with him all the time. Those are not the same thing. I'm not saying that. I'm saying whatever it is that's happening with him, it's always bad. Because in some cases, it just says, basically, this bad spirit comes upon him. And in other cases, it implies that something demonic is happening with him. And so it could be a little of both, and they could be separate ideas, or they could be related. I have no idea. I just know with all that going on, here's Saul who shows up to take David, and the Spirit of God came upon him also. And as he went, this is weird, isn't it? As he went, he prophesied. Here he is just giving utterances that are the expression of God's truth to people who wouldn't otherwise know it. He's prophesying, and he's there to kill God's chosen one. He's there to kill David, and yet he's prophesying on behalf of God now. What is happening with this man, and what's happening with people? Can't anybody execute someone effectively anymore? It's got to be frustrating for us. So anyway, the Spirit of God came upon him, and as he went, he prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah, and he too stripped off his clothes. This is a shameful act. I know people talk about it as if, that's a normal thing that all the prophets did. It is a shameful act, and in some ways, it's an expression for a prophet of some kind or whatever to say, I don't care about anything else. The message is the only thing that matters. But for Saul, this is a humiliating act. This is the king stripping himself naked and prophesying in favor of some idea from God that he's trying to thwart. So he too stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel and lay naked all that day and all that night. Thus it is said. So the rest of this statement, the thus it is said part, is a way of saying, oh, and by the way, I told you that whole story so you'd know where that expression comes from. You know, the one you've heard at the schoolyard or the one you heard at work the other day. And so we don't use this expression, so we don't think about what it means. But in this context, and you can figure this out intuitively, it's not complicated. This is just part of the process of discourse analysis, and you don't have to give it some technical name. It just means when you hear someone say something, you should pause and say, what do they actually mean by that? So when someone says, I'm thirsty, they're not just giving you a matter of fact about their current hydration condition. They're saying they want you to do something about it. Hey, I'm thirsty. Let's go get something to drink together. Or, hey, you've got a drink in your hand. Could I have a swig of that? You know, they're saying something to you about something you can do. And you figure that out sort of intuitively just because you know how language works, but also because you know how human beings are. When someone's thirsty and they express it, they're hoping someone will help them with the problem they've got. So it's the same kind of thing with this idiom. This expression that they use, which I'm about to give to you, is something they used in a different context. So that when the author here says, oh, and that's where that saying came from, everybody who uses it normally will go, oh, that's what that means. And so it says this. So he lay there naked all that day and all that night, and thus it is said, that's why people use this expression, is Saul also among the prophets? Now, the only thing that makes sense, and you know, you can never be certain about something like this, but I mean, it's the most obvious, sensible thing to take from that idiom, apparently, that they took up, is Saul also among the prophets? Is that even the person who is most opposed to what's going on in the circumstance ends up only being able to support it, only being able to help it go further along. And that's the point, definitely in this passage, that's the point of what's going on here, that there is no overcoming God's purpose. And let me just clarify, in context of David and Goliath, for instance, and all the parts of the story that are going on right now, what that means. David is the chosen one. He is the one chosen by God. He's it. What this means then is you can't change the fact that he is the inflection point for all the rest of mankind. On David, on his chosenness, on the Messiah, comes the conclusion of everyone else. And if someone says, well, I'm not going to let him be the main thing, they're going to end up being a part of the troop that's laying there naked on the ground and saying, yep, he's it. There's nothing you can do about it. The point being, there is no overcoming God's purpose. It's absolutely fixed. And in this case, that means everyone is going to be divided by one thing, and that's their response to the Messiah. Every division in the world is about our response to the Messiah. That's what this passage is implying. And there's nothing anyone can do to change that fact. The idea that we bury up this idea that God's will can't be thwarted into, you know, the idea that you don't actually have a will and, you know, you're not able to make any choices. And this is not about radical free will. It's not my favorite topic, the libertarian idea of a will, countercausal will, and all that stuff, which I love, and we should talk about another time. That's not the point here. It doesn't matter which way you interpret will. The point here isn't that people don't have a choice to make. The point here is they don't have a choice to make about the choice they have to make. You understand what I'm saying? You don't get to create the choices. You get to respond to the choices. The options in front of you are decided by God. Just like I've said a thousand times before, you don't get to choose whether when you step off of a building you fall or not. That's not an option for you. You do get to choose whether you step off the building or not. The point here is you don't get to say, as Saul, well, David's not important. He's not the person history's going to be about. You know, we don't get to say that. David is the person history is about. Now you say, well, I mean, this is David. I thought you were a Christian, not some kind of worshiper of David. Well, obviously, but Jesus is the son of David. That's why he's called that. He's not even called the son of Solomon. He's not called the son of any other king. And they're all closer to David than David is. They're all closer to Jesus than David is. I know I can get the words out. The point is, he's the son of David because in the Old Testament, David is the model we're supposed to look at as the chosen one. And so as I'm saying this, obviously I'm saying it about Jesus, that there is no undoing the fact that he's the chosen one, and in him is the determination of everything else that's going to be important about our lives. So the evidence of that everyone is divided by their response to the Messiah, comes up in the next chapter, in chapter 20. And in particular, it comes up in the middle of that chapter around verse 30, when Jonathan is going to try to talk Saul into making things right with David. Like why are you so hateful towards this person who's been trying to serve you? And so I'll read the passage to you just so you'll get the idea. It says, then Saul is angry as a hornet at Jonathan. I say that because he's about to try to kill him, which is absurd because his whole point is that he wants to kill David so that his son Jonathan can be king. So he's so angry at Jonathan because Jonathan doesn't recognize the threat that David poses to their family's lineage, that he's going to be willing to kill Jonathan, undermine his own cause. That's how self-destructive this kind of opposition to the reality about God's chosen one becomes. So anyway, as we're reading the story, it says, then Saul's anger is kindled against Jonathan because Jonathan's been trying to sort of wheedle some protection for David. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman. You were worried about what I was going to say there, wasn't you? I'm just reading the passage. Don't kill the messenger. You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame, to the shame of your mother's nakedness? By the way, which makes me want to say, yeah, well, who was laying naked not too long ago on the ground saying he's the one? Anyway, the point is, and this is what Saul says next, for as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Saul is committed to his own kingdom. That's what all this is about. Now, I'll come back and read that part again in a little bit to emphasize how opposed to David Saul is. But in this part of the story, I just want you to notice this. He says that to Jonathan, therefore, and then he says to Jonathan, so bring him to me so that I can kill him, for he shall surely die. Then Jonathan answered Saul his father and said, why should he be put to death? Listen to the conflict between these. This is father and son, the king and the heir apparent in Israel. So Jonathan says, why should he be put to death? What has he done? But Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him. So Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. And Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food for the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. Now, I read all of that to you. I'm going to read you one other passage. It's in Luke 12. You'll recognize the passage almost immediately. It's so strongly related. Maybe it's what Jesus is alluding to when he says this in Luke 12. When he says, I came to cast fire on the earth, and I would that it were already kindled. I have a baptism to be baptized with. You'll recognize it in just a second. And how great is my distress until it's accomplished? Do you think I've come to give peace on earth? This is what Jesus says. Now, obviously, he has come to bring peace on earth. He, in his own sermon, opening up his ministry, says to the people that you're blessed if you are a peacemaker. His point is to bring peace to the earth. And yet he says here, do you think I've come to bring peace on the earth? No. I tell you rather, but division. Now, it's not super complicated to interpret this and understand why he's a peacemaker, and yet he's saying he's going to bring division, because what he's bringing is the reality that people, and sometimes we misinterpret this and we behave badly as Christians because of it. We think he's saying, you need to go home and reject your family and tell them you don't love them anymore and what you love is me instead. That's the opposite of what he's saying. But what he is saying is this: when you tell your family that you love me, you need to be prepared for the fact that they might reject you. And when they do, you've already made your choice. Your choice was me. So when they reject you, you accept the cross that they put on you. That's why you're choosing the cross the day you choose to follow Christ. Now, all of that, and we've talked about all that before, but I want you to hear it, how he says it here. Think of this in the context, what I'm about to read to you. Think of it in the context of what just happened with Jonathan and Saul, his father. Saul, why on earth are you choosing? Don't you realize what he's going to do? Our kingdom is the one we ought to be defending. And Jonathan, whoa, what on earth did David do to deserve to be condemned? You shouldn't be condemning him. Saul is so angry he wants to kill Jonathan, and Jonathan is so angry he can't eat, and he storms out of the room. There is division in the family because of him. Listen to what it says here. Do you think I've come to bring peace, to what Jesus says in Luke 12? Do you think I've come to bring peace on the earth? No, but rather division. For from now on, in one house, there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. And what's the first example he gives? They will be divided, father against son, and son against father. Exactly what happens with Saul and Jonathan. I'm making the point, not that Jesus has to be alluding to that, although that story surely would come into people's minds when they would hear this from Jesus in the Jewish context. But whether it did or not doesn't change the fact that we're reading in a story about the chosen one, about David, that the central family in Israel, the king and the heir apparent, are being divided over their loyalty to David. Are you going to be loyal to David or not? That's what all of this is about. And this is the point of saying there's no overcoming God's purpose. The reality is that David is the chosen one. And if you're going to choose to be against David, then that's going to be a problem. And if you choose to be for David, then that's going to create some problems. No matter what you do, it is always going to be about the response to the Messiah. So now there are 2 possible responses. There are 2 directions that this can go. One is to be against him, right? And then the other is to be for him. So let me give you what these passages imply about those who are against God's chosen one and what happens with it. So in the story, it happens over and over again. It's always going to come down to this reality that even if you are against him, your opposition to him is ultimately only going to further his cause. There's nothing, not only is there nothing you can do to keep God from accomplishing what he wants to accomplish because the world's being divided by whether it chooses the Messiah or not, but also if you don't choose the Messiah and you choose somehow to oppose him, to fight against him, what you do will actually accomplish exactly what needed to happen for him. You end up benefiting him no matter what you do. And so this is the case with Saul. Happens to him almost from the beginning. I'll read it to you in these words at the end of chapter 18 so you can see it. This is where we started, was in chapter 18, in this section of Scripture. So in chapter 18, what's happened is Saul has already become nervous. Remember at the very beginning of the chapter, Jonathan loves him as his own soul, gives him his armor and his bow and his belt and everything. And this is good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's own servants. But when they start coming back from other battles and Saul's people are singing, Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s, then it describes Saul as being angry and fearful. He is angry, and I'm reading now in chapter 18, verse 8. Saul was angry, and the saying displeased him. And his response is to say, well, I mean, what more can the man have but the kingdom itself? And Saul eyes David from that day on. And then a harmful spirit rushes on Saul, and he's raving in his house. And so David does what he does. He comes in as a servant to play the instrument for Saul, to soothe his soul. And Saul hurls a spear at him, thinking, I'll just pin him to the wall, and then we'll be done with it. But David evades him. He escapes. He's a skilled warrior, so he does these things. He's Jackie Chan, right? So in verse 12, Saul was afraid. I don't even know if people know who Jackie Chan is anymore. Surely you do. So Saul was afraid of David. It's not David's afraid of Saul. Saul is afraid of David. That's why he's doing all of these things. And in fact, at the end of that little section, down around verse 15 and 16, it says, when Saul saw that David was having great success, because Saul is trying to send David out to these battles and hoping he'll be killed in the battles. But every time he sends David out to a battle, David wins the battle. And so he's standing in fearful awe of him because David is having such great success. And all Israel and Judah are loving David even more because he's going out and he's coming in before them and he's winning all these battles. It'll say that again in just a little bit. That's when Saul sends messengers to kill David, to take him in his house and bring him to Saul so that he can kill him. And so Michal herself is going to be the snare. And so what happens first is Saul says, yeah, I remember David, he was in love with Michal, right? He wanted to marry one of my daughters, so we'll make that work out. So Saul's daughter loves David, it says in verse 20. And Saul is thinking to himself, I can use that as a snare. And so he sets the trap. Yeah, well, if you want my daughter's hand in marriage, sure, that'd be fine. Just go kill a bunch of Philistines and bring evidence that you killed them. And it's gruesome evidence, so you can read that for yourself. I'll just let you figure that part out. Anyway, you bring the evidence that you killed these Philistines. It's a really inhumane time to be in the world. Anyway, the point is, David does it. He does it twice as much as what Saul told him. And because of that, all the people of Israel know how great a warrior David is again. Look at what he did, and he's going out and he's winning these battles again, and Saul is even more afraid of David. This is down in verse 29, and Saul was David's enemy continually. And this is the verse I wanted to read to you in verse 30. This is all a result of Saul trying to trap David and kill David. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. If you get to the next chapter, Saul tries to kill him again. This is the one where he sends messengers to David's house to take him in his bed. And it fails, and Saul runs into exactly the same problem, tries to kill David the same way, throw a spear at him at one point because he's in such a bad mood about it. And all of those things having transpired, the result is David is still winning battles and going out and impressing people. And then, every single time in this story, in all of these accounts that take place in chapters 18 through 21, every single time somebody tries to oppose David, he ends up accomplishing even greater victories than before. And so, this is like, I'll read it to you here at the end of chapter 19. Jonathan says to David, you go in peace because we've sworn both of us in the name of the Lord. The Lord shall be between me and you and between my offspring and your offspring forever. You know why he says that? Because he meets with David in the field after he met with his father, and his father said, you've got to kill David. This is what has to happen. And when Jonathan storms off, he makes this arrangement with David that seals their relationship with each other permanently. Everything that Saul does to try to undermine David ends up turning into something that is serving the purpose that God has for David. Even those who are against the chosen one end up only furthering his cause. There is no escaping this reality about David, in this case, David in the Old Testament, being the chosen one. And so you would think that we would learn this about how God is accomplishing what he wants through David. Okay, that's on one side. The other option is when a person chooses David instead. So in chapter 20, I'll use this as sort of the central passage to make the point. So in chapter 20, when Jonathan is establishing the covenant that he has with David, it describes it this way in verse 16. Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. That is, may God oppose those who oppose David, right? So everything's going to be about whether somebody favors David or not. And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. All of this is when Jonathan and David, they're out in the field and they're establishing this relationship with each other that's never going to be violated. And this is, I'll read you the whole section starting in verse 12 of chapter 20. Jonathan said to David, the Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow or the third day, behold, if he's well disposed toward David," this is before that big conflict he has with Saul that I read to you a moment ago. He says, "Well, then I'll send and disclose it to you." You remember the arrows sign and all that. "But should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also if I do not disclose it to you and send you away that you may go in safety. I choose you over even my father." That's what he's saying to him. "May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father." This is not Jonathan saying, "I hate my father." This is Jonathan saying, there was a point at which God had chosen my father, and I've been committed to him. But now it's obvious God has chosen you, and so I am committed to you. And so he says, "May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever." When the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies." And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. And by the time you get to the end of the chapter, you have that section that I read to you a moment ago. Then Jonathan, in verse 42, then Jonathan said to David, so, Jonathan goes, he argues with his dad about it, and then he goes back out into the field, tells the boy about the arrows. "Oh, they're too far for you. Don't worry about it." And so David knows the sign is bad. Saul is still against him, and Jonathan, David aren't going to be able to hang out together anymore. And so they love each other, they grieve with each other, and they part ways. It's that moment in the field. And Jonathan says to David, "Go in peace, because we've sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever." The obvious sign of the covenant is simply that Jonathan has chosen David. And because of that, God is going to bless Jonathan because he has blessed David. It's exactly what we hear from the beginning of the covenant with Abraham. When God sends Abraham away from his homeland to a land that he will show them, and he says, you go to that country, and I am going to use you to bless the nations of the earth. How does he describe it to him? "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." The point is, the choice, the inflection point for all of mankind is the one that's chosen by God. Abraham in Genesis 12, or here in 1 Samuel 17 through 21, David, who is the chosen one. Jonathan chooses David, and so he's going to be blessed in this way. By the way, in the story, all of Saul's people end up being slaughtered. They're all being killed in one way or another. The only person who survives is a descendant of Jonathan when Saul's household is being killed. Jonathan dies with Saul. Jonathan's son even dies, but his grandson, the one that's crippled in some way or another, that's has an injury from his youth, that one is taken up by David and cared for from that day forward in response to this promise that he's made with Jonathan. That's how important it is that Jonathan is in his relationship with David, that his protection comes from that. So I'm telling you all this to put it in context like this. I'm 61 years old now, right? So I got married young. I was still a kid when I got married and graduated from college. I'd already been married a couple of years by the time I graduated, and moved up to Arlington from Waco, where I graduated from college, and, started renting a house because that's all I could afford to do. I didn't have the resources or finances to pay 15% down on some house. So yeah, it was just an absurd option for me. So rent a house. We met a really nice guy who allowed us to rent a house, and I thought to myself, okay, I'm doing well. I've got a house that I can live in. My children are not living on the street. I had one child, and then I had another shortly thereafter, and so 2 children. We're not living on the street. Everything's going to be fine, and I'm making it. But it's like I'm not where all those other people were. When they graduated from college with me, they were thinking about buying houses and, moving into something successful. And so I wasn't embarrassed by it, but, I was a little disappointed in myself. And I certainly wasn't, measuring up to what I thought my dad would expect of me, that I would be able to buy a house. Well, as it turns out, a few years later, the guy that owned the house was headed, towards, and I ended up preaching his funeral. He was headed towards the end of his life, and he sort of wanted to sell the house. And so he told us about it, and we told him, we would love to buy it, but we just can't, there's no way we could afford it. And this was the nicest guy ever. And I did some ministry things with him, and so he was considerate about ministry also. And he just said, what we'll do, we'll take your rent to this point as the down payment, and then you can buy the house. And so for no reason of any credit of my own at all, I suddenly was able to buy a house. And I thought, oh man, my dad is going to be so proud of this. To me, that was a huge deal. And I don't know whether he was or not. I never did. But in my own heart, I thought, I know my dad's proud of me now because I'm buying a house, right? I'm a homeowner now. That's a huge deal. So I don't know what order these things took place in. This was almost 40 years ago now. But here's the next thing that happened. I pull out of the driveway in this house that I now own. And as I'm backing up in my car, which is what you do it in a car. I'm backing up in my car. I wasn't just backing up with my feet. I'm backing up in my car, and sure enough, I crunch into a car that had parked across the street right behind my driveway, right? Not their fault. I mean, they just parked, along the curb. But, it's a nuisance when somebody parks behind your driveway. So it's a pet peeve. Get that part off. Still, totally my fault. I should have been looking in the rearview mirror. And anybody would, and I would now. I'm not that bad a driver. It's 40 years ago. Back off, okay? Give me some space. So I backed into the car and just crunched the bumper and, the fender on their car, and bent the bumper on my car, and totally embarrassing. Left a note, and fixed it. And, it was a no, we don't want to call insurance. You don't want to call insurance either. Okay, fine. We'll give you $500 and forget the whole thing, right? And so it was, all worked out fine in that way. But then it's like here I am, an adult with 2 kids, pastoring a church already. And it's like, I can't tell my dad about this. I'm too embarrassed. I'm not going to tell him about it. And I just didn't. I knew he would see it and that he would say something. And I had worked out in my head. I don't even know how I did it. I had worked out in my head how to avoid it, not to lie about it, but just to avoid the question. And so I avoided the question, and I remember he asked something about it and I kind of avoided it. And so I got out of the conversation, whatever. I mean, it wasn't a day later, maybe 2 days later. I'm just wrecked with anxiety about the fact that I haven't been willing to tell my dad about this shameful thing, that I was a bad driver and backed into somebody. I was so embarrassed. And it's weird that it still affects me. And so I went to his office. I never went to his office, hardly at all. I drove to his office and sat there and waited for a few moments for him to be free so that I could go in and sit down with him in his office and tell him about this stupid thing that I did so that he could tell me what a stupid person I was, And as I sat there and told him, I can't remember at all what words he said at all, because all that mattered was that what he said amounted to this: I don't care about that. I'm so proud of you and just so glad you're my son. He didn't care a whit that I hadn't told him about the accident, that I had avoided telling him about it, and he just wanted me to know it's fine. Nothing you can do is going to make me ashamed or wish I wasn't your dad. All that mattered was that he was my dad. And that's what I'm saying about this story and what makes it so important. Once we know David is the chosen one, all that matters is whether you're in him or not. What we're thinking is, he's going to be so proud of me now. I beat the Philistine garrison. Oh, surely I'll be acceptable now. That's not what does it. It's just the fact that Jonathan chooses David. That's all. That Jonathan is with David. His grandson is going to survive because Jonathan chooses David. And nothing that anyone does that falls short would take them out of that covenant. That's the point of them establishing the covenant. The way he establishes it is by saying, no matter what happens now, if I'm alive, you won't kill me. And if my descendants are around, you won't kill them. You won't cut them off. All that matters is that they are in you. We choose you. And that's what we talk about in Christianity. I mean, we talk about this doctrine of exclusivity and there's only salvation in Christ as if the point is somehow that God is stubbornly resistant to the idea of somebody finding their own way into heaven. Wouldn't that be terrible? God's not out to keep people from getting into heaven. It's just the fact that he has a chosen one. He has one who has merited his favor, one who has stood up to everything else, one who is chosen and anointed by him for the purpose of blessing all the families of the earth. That's the whole point of it. And in that one, we have the relationship that matters entirely. And in that relationship, when we show up saying, look what mighty things I have done by accomplishing nothing with my own merit, I'm a homeowner now. Aren't I magnificent? We say all of this, and it adds up to nothing. But we walk in and say, I completely failed. I made the mistake, and I wasn't honest about it, and I couldn't face you about it. And he hugs us and embraces us and says, it doesn't matter because you are in me. That's all that matters. And so I want us to recognize and remember how important it is that we know that God has chosen one, and putting us in him has chosen us and made us his forever.
Thanks for joining us for Coffee with Creamer. Your cup of coffee may be finished, but we are not. Come back next week for a refill as we sit down to examine a new set of ideas and cultural issues. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or visit our website at barrycreamer.com. Until next time, keep your mug hot and your mind sharp.